At just past 6:30 in the morning on the 1st of December 1948, two strangers walking along Somerton Beach in Adelaide noticed a man slumped against the seawall. His legs were stretched out in front of him. His feet were crossed at the ankles, calm, almost deliberate, like a man who had simply sat down to rest and never gotten back up. A half-smoked cigarette had fallen from his collar onto his coat. At first, nobody was alarmed. People had seen him the night before, sitting in nearly the same spot, his arm rising and falling in a strange, jerky motion. Someone assumed he was drunk. Someone else assumed he was asleep. Nobody checked. By morning, he was dead. He was a well-built man, somewhere in his 40s, dressed in a suit far too formal for a beach. No wallet, no identification, no wound, no blood, no sign that anyone had touched him. And when police searched his pockets, they found something stranger than nothing at all. Every single tag on his clothing had been removed, not torn off carelessly, cut out deliberately, thread by thread, as if someone wanted to erase every possible trace of who he was before he ever lay down on that beach. This is the story of the Somerton Man. For 74 years, he had no name. When science finally gave him one, it didn't give investigators an ending. It gave them a new set of questions. The autopsy told doctors almost nothing they could use. His organs were healthy. His heart showed no disease. There were no needle marks, no bruising, no external trauma of any kind. And yet a pathologist noted his pupils were unusually small, and his spleen was strangely enlarged, findings often associated with poisoning. The trouble was, no toxicologist could identify the poison. Whatever had killed him left almost no trace, which meant either it had fully broken down in his body, or it was something rare enough that 1948 forensic science simply didn't have the tools to catch it. Detectives had a body they couldn't identify, a cause of death they couldn't confirm, and a total absence of anyone reporting him missing. In a country where every citizen was accounted for through ration cards and war-era paperwork, a grown man had apparently walked out of his life without a single person noticing he was gone. Weeks after the body was found, a brown suitcase turned up at the Adelaide railway station cloakroom, checked in the day before his death and never collected. Inside were ordinary clothes, a dressing gown, a coat, some underwear, a pair of trousers with an unusual repair stitched into them using a rare waxed thread not sold in Australia. And once again, the labels had been carefully removed from almost every item. Only one small tag survived, reading simply, "Keen," which led nowhere. It was as if someone had wanted the suitcase to be found, but only after every clue inside it had been stripped away. For months, the case sat cold. Then, in June of the following year, a pathologist re-examining the dead man's clothing found something the original search had missed. Soon into a small, hidden pocket inside the waistband of his trousers, so tightly rolled it had gone unnoticed for half a year, was a tiny scrap of paper. On it, in an elegant printed script, were two words, "Tamam Shud." A local newspaper reporter recognized the phrase as Persian and suggested police track down its origin. It turned out to be the closing line of the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, a centuries-old collection of poetry about fate, mortality, and the fleeting nature of life. Tamam Shud translates roughly to "it is over" or "it is finished." Police launched a nationwide search for the exact copy of the book the page had been torn from, believing whoever owned it might be the key to the entire case. Astonishingly, it worked. A man came forward saying he'd found a copy of the same book, missing its final page, tossed onto the back seat of his unlocked car near the beach, on the very night the Somerton Man was last seen alive. The torn edge matched perfectly, but the book held more than the missing page. Under ultraviolet light, investigators found faint intentions on the inside back cover, an unlisted telephone number, and beneath it 5 lines of capital letters arranged like a code. No spaces, no obvious pattern, no repetition that matched any language investigators could identify. Cryptographers at the time tried and failed to crack it. Cryptographers today, working with far more powerful tools, have still failed to crack it. It is one of the most examined, least understood collections of letters in the history of criminal investigation. The phone number, at least, led somewhere. It belonged to a young nurse living less than a kilometer from where the body was found. Her name, according to later research, was Jessica Thompson, though at the time she asked police to keep her identity out of the papers, and for decades the public knew her only by a pseudonym. When investigators showed her a plaster cast made from the dead man's face, she did not simply say she didn't recognize him. According to those present, she looked as though she might faint. She denied ever meeting him. But she admitted something else entirely, that she had once owned an identical copy of the Rubaiyat and had given it away years earlier during the war to a man she knew. That man's name was Alfred Boxall. For a moment, detectives believed the case was solved. Boxall must be the Somerton Man. They tracked him down in Sydney, still very much alive, working an ordinary job with his own copy of the Rubaiyat sitting on a shelf. Final page intact, Tamam Shud still printed exactly where it should be. It wasn't him. It had never been him, which meant the book the dead man carried had been torn by someone else entirely. Someone who wanted that specific phrase on that specific page carried on his body when he died. For 60 years, Jessica Thompson said almost nothing more. She married, raised a family, and lived an ordinary life, while one of the country's strangest mysteries orbited quietly around her name. But there was one detail she could never fully explain away. Not long after the Somerton Man's death, she gave birth to a son. That son grew up with an unusual, genetically rare trait. A distinctive irregularity in the shape of his ears, a trait doctors consider uncommon enough to be almost a fingerprint. Photographs of the Somerton Man taken before burial appeared to show the exact same trait. Thompson's daughter would later say her mother implied, without ever stating it outright, that she knew far more about the man's identity than she had ever told police. Whether that meant a hidden relationship, a wartime connection, or something she was actively protecting, she took most of it to her grave. She died in 2007, having spent 6 decades saying just enough to keep the mystery alive and never quite enough to end it. Around this same period, theories about the Somerton Man multiplied. Because the case broke just as the Cold War was intensifying, and because his clothing labels had been so deliberately stripped away, some investigators became convinced he was a foreign spy, poisoned for what he knew or who he'd betrayed. Others pointed to the unusual, overdeveloped muscles in his calves, a trait sometimes associated with ballet dancers, and floated the idea he'd led some kind of double life entirely disconnected from his final, anonymous death on an Australian beach. Still others believed the simplest explanation was the truest one. A man in love with someone he couldn't have, carrying her book to the beach, choosing a phrase that meant, "It is finished," as his final word to the world. None of these theories were ever proven. All of them were in some way plausible. That is what kept the case alive for 3/4 of a century. Then, in 2021, with modern DNA science finally advanced enough to try, researchers exhumed the Somerton Man's grave. Using genetic material combined with public genealogy databases, a University of Adelaide team led by Professor Derek Abbott spent months building out a family tree from the smallest surviving traces of his DNA. In July of 2022, they announced what they believed was a match. The Somerton Man had a name, Carl Webb, a 43-year-old electrical engineer and instrument maker from Melbourne, reportedly estranged from his family, with a fondness for poetry and a habit of writing his own. It should have been the ending. In many ways, it wasn't, because knowing his name answered almost nothing else. Investigators still don't know why an engineer from Melbourne ended up on a beach in Adelaide with every label cut from his clothes. They still don't know what killed him, or whether it was murder, suicide, or something else entirely. They still don't know what the code in the back of that book actually says, or why he was carrying a phrase that means the end sewn into a hidden pocket, as if he'd planned for someone, eventually, to find it. 74 years after 2 strangers found him leaning calmly against a seawall, the Somerton Man finally has a face people can put a name to. What he still doesn't have is an explanation. Maybe the code was never meant to be solved. Maybe that was the point. A message folded so tightly, hidden so deliberately, that even science 70 years later could only get halfway there. So the question isn't really who he was anymore. It's what he knew, and whether anyone left alive still remembers enough to finish what he started.